Good morning, everybody. My name is Daniel Eischen. I'm the chair of the British Chamber of Commerce for Luxembourg, and I'm very delighted, very happy to welcome you all to this 2020 edition of our Leadership Forum. We are in the middle of a very special year, we all know it, and at the British Chamber we tried to adapt to this. And that's why our traditional leadership forum, which is one of our flagship events over the year, which normally runs through one evening, has been adapted, and we'll be together with you, hopefully, for the entire week. So we have a plan of 5 really top speakers over this week, 1 speaker per day, and we'll start this morning with Simon. I think it's going to be really an amazing event, and it's going to help us go through these times of a little bit uncertainty. Times of uncertainty, clearly a topic that we will cover over the next days. Beyond Here Be Dragons, very exciting topic. I was really amazed when I heard that by our People in Leadership group when they proposed that title, because I couldn't imagine anything with it until I took a little look into old sea maps, marine maps, and saw what it meant. So, and as a business owner, I can absolutely identify with the problem of beyond here, there's the unknown. Nobody knows what to do in specific times. And I'm sure we're going to get lots of interesting insight over the next days on how you can manage a company or how you can manage your life in a situation where there is a lot of uncertainty and you're going through uncharted waters. At least I'm going to be very, very interested to hear this. So welcome again. Good to have you here. I really want to be brief, so I would like to thank a lot Jill, Sarah, and the entire People in Leadership group at the British Chamber of Commerce who organized this event and who also be hosting it and moderating it. I will hand over to Jill in just a couple of seconds. So a huge thanks to you guys for the organization, for getting all these interesting speakers lined up and promoting the event. Of course, thank you to Rebecca at the Secretariat, and then a huge thanks to our sponsors who are Alter Domus and Luxstates, who are supporting us in organizing this, and your support, of course, is very valuable. Thanks a lot to all of you. And with this, I'm handing over to Jill Saville. Jill.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. One thing that these online things does is it allows us to have no barriers at all. So welcome wherever you are. Before I introduce Simon, just a quick note, you can see that this is a meeting. It is not a webinar, which means you can see everybody. We want it to be interactive. The chat is there. Please use it. Make any comments as anybody's talking as we go along. We're going to be monitoring the chat for your questions, so please feel free to use them at any time. Format, we're going to go for about an hour, and Simon's going to start. Then we're going to have a 10-minute breakout where you're going to go into very small groups, 4 people or less, and just talk about what Simon says. There's an old nursery around there. And then come back and we can start to have your questions. Please, I know that there's going to be noise and I know we're not going to be perfect, but let's try and keep everything on mute when we're not speaking. So without further ado, I want to introduce Simon. Simon Anholt, I came across him because he was publishing his recent book, which I know he's going to talk about. And I'm a little in awe of introducing him, because if you've got somebody and it says that he speaks to governments and monarchs and everybody else, then obviously there's some slight trepidation. But he's human, he has dogs. We've decided that means he's a really good person. And if you've not heard of his name, you've heard of nation branding, I'm sure. And we might have 1 or 2 people from the Luxembourg Nation Branding Project on the line today. He's a TED speaker, and those of us who've been watching his TED Talk, it's approached 7 million, I think. On YouTube, it was 4 million, talking about this good country equation. So I'm very, very grateful that he's made the time today, because I know that he's been grilled by Italians. I follow him on Twitter. And he's been on the radio in Ireland. But it's my great pleasure to introduce Simon Anholt. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jill, and I'm really pleased to be here. This is a great event, and all events have a feel about them, which you can pick up on almost at the first contact. And this one felt good. It felt collegiate. It felt intelligent, and it felt as if the attendees considered it to be important, which is the most valuable thing if you're speaking at something. So as Jill said, I've been asked, and I really do appreciate it, to talk a little bit about my book. I'll follow it won't be a promo for the book, but I will follow the main storyline of the book, because that will help me to fit in the entire subject within the 25 minutes or so I've got now. And that would otherwise be a difficult thing to do, because there's a lot to talk about. It does start, as Jill says, with so-called nation branding. And that's a rather unhappy story. Back in the late 1990s, I'd been working in the private sector. I was very interested in brands and branding. And I was particularly interested in what marketing academics call the country of origin effect. In other words, what impact it has on a product or service to the consumer, knowing that that product or service comes from a given country. So the fact that you know that your Coke comes from America and your Levi's come from America, but your Benetton or your Ferrari, if you're lucky, comes from Italy, and your Chanel comes from France, those associations are very potent, of course. And we all know that they add some form of complex and sometimes very positive brand equity from the country of origin to the product, and they give it a head start in the marketplace. If you're trying to sell consumer electronics from Guatemala, the country of origin association is less helpful, because that's not what people are expecting. And you have to fight significantly harder to get people to believe that that's a product worth looking at. So this was my original area of interest. And as I looked more and more at this country of origin effect, it began to occur to me that the country itself had its own brand image, and that brand image was incredibly important to the progress and the prosperity of all countries in a globalized world, because all countries, to an extent, are competing against each other all the time for their share of what's going. And what's going is consumers for their products and services, tourists, foreign investors, business and leisure visitors of all sorts. And the better the image of the country, the easier it is to attract people. And put bluntly, countries with a powerful and positive reputation find that everything is easy and everything is relatively cheap. And countries with a weak or a negative reputation find that everything is difficult and everything is expensive. And this has profound implications for macroeconomics, because one of the things that this image effect does is it massively amplifies the gap between rich countries and poor countries. Poor countries not only have to cope very often with weak institutions and weak infrastructure, but they also have to sail constantly against this powerful headwind of a negative reputation. Either people have never heard of them, or they have heard of them and they think they're no good. And this, as I say, tends to increase rather than narrow the wealth gap. So it began to occur to me that management of the country's good name has to be today one of the primary responsibilities of good governments. It's really essential that governments understand that this is no trivial or superficial matter. This plays a determining role in their progress and their prosperity on the international stage. And when a government comes into office, it inherits, if you like, a sacred responsibility for the good name of the nation. And one of the ways in which I think we view good government in our modern age is from that perspective. A government that inherits the good name of the nation in a particular standard and hands it down to its successors in office in at least as good condition or even better condition than before, will go down in history as a good leader. A leader that does something to diminish or impoverish or worsen the country's image will very likely go down in history as a bad leader. And so this started me along quite an interesting track, which, to put it crudely, was the idea of governments accepting that today, in our age of advanced globalization, they are as much brand managers as they are policymakers. And that immediately implies new kinds of relationships with the private sector, new ways of looking at national strategy, and new ways at framing policy issues. Not only are they good policies, but also, do they help tell the story of who we are, or do they hinder it? Or do we run the risk of tarnishing our reputation? Of course, there's a common perception that it's very difficult to build the image of a country, and it's very easy to damage it. Actually, I haven't found this to be true. I think it may be true in the private sector. Companies can indeed destroy their reputations overnight if they're careless or unlucky. With countries, it doesn't seem to be like that. The good image of countries that are lucky enough to have a good image seems to be extraordinarily robust and extraordinarily resilient. The United States, for example, has been trying as hard as it can to damage its image for about 300 years, and it still hasn't entirely succeeded. People want to love America, and they want to love the countries they love. And part of the reason is because national images really don't shift very much. And so in 2005, I decided it was time to try to get some data on this topic, because I discovered that nobody had ever really bothered to measure the images of countries. And there was no good research out there. So in 2005, I launched an annual study called the Nation Brands Index. Actually, I ran it quarterly for the first 2 years, but it changed so little from quarter to quarter. I realized I'd just engendered the world's most boring social survey. The results were literally identical in every quarter. And so from 2008, when I teamed up with the research company GfK Roper to enlarge and enhance the survey, we started doing it annually. And it's been running annually ever since. And what it does is it fields a very large and very detailed questionnaire to about 20,000 ordinary people. So we use a census sample of the population in 20 countries, 1,000 in each country, which is a massive oversample, but it's good to be sure. And that produces a ranking of the 50 countries that we include in the study every year. The United Kingdom has been included since the very beginning, of course, and Luxembourg has been included on a couple of occasions when they've subscribed and the government has wanted to look at its own data. The results are fascinating, and I could spend all day talking about them, but I suppose the most important discovery of all from the Nation Brands Index was this fact that I alluded to a moment ago, which is that people don't like changing their minds about countries. I was expecting the thing to be somewhat volatile. And if you read the newspapers, you'd probably expect the same thing as well. People are forever talking in a rather loose, vague kind of way about how no doubt France has destroyed its image by losing a football match. And no doubt President Trump has trashed the image of America for all time. But do we actually know that for sure? Or when we say, for example, the United Kingdom had a fantastically successful Olympics in 2012. No doubt that's massively improved Britain's image. Well, has it? And how do we know? So the Nation Brands Index tries to give some answers to some of those questions, and the results are indeed always fascinating, but the most fascinating thing of all is that none of those things appear to make very much difference. It's as if the images of countries in the minds of the general population around the world are kind of rusted into place. And that's partly because, as it turns out, people don't like thinking about other countries very much. They find it difficult and confusing. And that's partly because there are so many of them. Last time I checked yesterday evening, I think there were 195. And that's an awful lot of different countries to be knowing about and thinking about. And the consequence is that even those of us who, for example, like the ones at this group today, almost all work internationally, highly educated, we don't think very much about other countries. In fact, what the Nation Brands Index suggests is that most people only ever think about 3 countries. They think about their own country, not a lot. a bit more if it's contested for some reason or another, or if it's in trouble. They think about a very powerful nation that has an influence over their daily lives. That's usually the United States or China or something of that sort, or the major hegemon within their region. And they think about a third country, which is entirely personal. It's a country that's up there because they have some connection to it. The Maldives, I've always wanted to go there. Chile, my daughter is thinking of moving there, something of that sort. And basically, that's it. 3 countries. As I say, 195 countries on Earth. So what does that mean? That effectively means that the overwhelming majority of humanity, for the overwhelming majority of humanity, to all intents and purposes, 192 countries simply don't exist. And what people do is they plonk their prejudices and perceptions, the brand image, as I called it, of the country in the freezer at the back of their mind, and they never pull it out or question it or interrogate it until and unless they're absolutely forced to. And that pretty much never happens. And so almost whatever a country does or says, it's not going to make very much difference to the way in which humanity regards that country. The British view of Luxembourg is part of the British culture. Luxembourg's view of Britain is part of the Luxembourgish culture. We pick these things up not from the media day by day, but we absorb them from the culture around us decade by decade. We learn our approaches and our perceptions to other countries from our family, from our friends, from the media, from our schools, from everything around us, and they become vast, solid cultural constructs. And that's why a positive image is such a very, very attractive thing to governments, because it makes everything so cheap and so easy, and because it's so robust and so useful compared, for example, to a corporate image. So the question, of course, arises, if you're not happy with the image you've got, and believe me, most countries aren't, what can you do to improve it? And this is where my big mistake right at the beginning in the 90s began to come back to haunt me. Because I'd used that word brand, people assumed that I was talking about something rather different called branding. Now, 3 letters don't usually make much of a difference, but here they really do. Because brand, I was just using as a synonym for reputation or image or perception, if you're looking at it from the other way around. And my observation was a simple one. Countries have these things called images, and they're very important. Branding, on the other hand, sounds like a promise. It sounds as if you're saying to a country, if you don't like the image you've got, we know how to change it for you. We can manipulate public perceptions using the devilish tricks in the marketing box. Branding is a term that very usefully doesn't really have a definition, so you can use it to mean whatever you want. The branding agencies use it to mean corporate identity, mostly logo design. Does a logo change the image of a country? Of course it doesn't. The advertising people often use it to mean marketing communications, as do the digital communications people. And that's not about, it's not about that either. America is the most competent and best funded communicator in the world. America invented public relations and advertising and branding. It still has absolutely no ability to influence its own international image. And that's clear from the survey every single year we run it. So at this point, we're left with a really interesting and quite troubling dilemma that national image is, if you like, the impossible necessity. Countries desperately need a powerful and positive image in order to compete, to appear in this very busy and very crowded marketplace of global consumers. But on the other hand, it seems as if there's almost nothing they can do to affect it. And that's kind of bad news. So I started looking for a way out. And all the governments that I was advising up until this point were starting to say, look, what you say about this is very interesting, Simon, but you're basically telling us there's nothing we can do about it. So what do? We kick you out, we pay your bill, and then what? You say that running an advertising or a marketing campaign or changing our logo or our slogan isn't going to make any difference at all. In fact, you've showed us data to prove that it's never made any difference for any country. So what does make a difference? And I found myself thinking, good question. So in 2012, I noticed, because somebody pointed it out to me, that the Nation Brands Index by this stage had accumulated over 1 billion data points. And that's big data by any standard. And it occurred to me that I never had time to really dive in and analyze that data and ask it some simple questions. So I thought, I'm going to take a year off and I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to dive into the accumulated database of 1 billion data points, and I'm going to ask this database, why do people admire country A more than country B? Because they certainly do. Every time we know that people on the whole around the world admire the Czech Republic more than they admire the Slovak Republic. Why? I just don't know. And we needed to know. So what I later ended up calling the Mars model, MARSS, was a piece of analysis which attempted to identify the key drivers of a positive national image, because that was worth treasure. And MARSS were the initial letters of the principal drivers. The first one was morality, which I'm going to come back to. That was the unexpected one. The second one was more expected, aesthetics. Do I think that this country looks nice? Do I think it's got a beautiful landscape or beautiful people or beautiful buildings or beautiful products? Those of us who are sighted tend to judge an awful lot about the world, in fact, almost everything about the world, through our visual perception of it. And we think that if a country is beautiful, then it must be good, strong, powerful, reliable, and so forth. The R is relevance. Does this country have relevance to my daily life? I may be fascinated by Guatemala, which is why I keep on repeating the name of the place, but does it really have an impact on my life in Europe? Possibly not, in which case that's a reason for it not to be a powerful driver. The first S is sophistication. Is this a technologically advanced country? Because if I'm a typical person around the world, I rather admire that. Or is it the Kazakhstan of Borat? Are people still plowing the fields with oxen? In which case, maybe interesting for tourism, but not much else. And then the second S is strength, which is the equivalent of Professor Nye's hard power. Does it have a big army, a big economy, a big land area, a big population? Can it impose its will on the international community? And that is also a contributor to a powerful and positive reputation, which is one of the main reasons why, for example, America and China rank reasonably high in the Nation Brands Index. America is nearly always first, historically, but I'm going to come back to that. But the first one, M, which I called morality, it's not a very good word for it, but I wanted the thing to be a pronounceable acronym, turned out to be by a very, very wide margin, the most significant driver of the lot, by a factor of nearly 6. And what it basically said was, I think that this country is a force for good in the world. I think it contributes something to the international community. I think it makes the world a better place for me and my children and my grandchildren. Therefore, I admire it. And if I believe that about it, I admire it proportionally more than any other reason. So, to put a couple of obvious examples on this, most people around the world admire Norway. Norway is, by almost every measure, a somewhat marginal player. It's not a major power. Most people know very little about it, but most people admire it. And the reason that they admire it is because they have a sense, they've absorbed a sense over the course of their life, that this is a responsible and principled player in the international community. They've heard of the Oslo Peace Accord, and they think that Oslo is probably in Norway, and they think it was something to do with Israel-Palestine, and that's an example of how good these Norwegians are. And I'm glad that Norway exists. And so as I drift off to sleep at night, I don't worry about Norway. I don't expect to be awoken at 3 a.m. by Norwegian terrorists standing around my bed. Russia, on the other hand, I don't know much about Russia either, but everything I hear about Russia seems to be that this is a country that in one way or another disturbs the international order. It disturbs the equilibrium of the planet and the international community. And in consequence, I do worry about it a bit as I'm drifting off to sleep. And the difference there, when you multiply it by 7 or 8 billion people, is beyond calculation. Because the fact that most of us prefer Norway means that we will reward Norway with our tourism, with our investment. We'll buy its products, we'll hire its people. Everything about it appeals to us slightly more. We give it preference. It trades at a premium. Russia trades at a discount. We don't trust its people. We don't trust its products. We're not so keen to go there on holiday. Maybe go to the World Cup because that's kind of special, and maybe that helps. But on the whole, that's the difference. And this translates over time into trillions of dollars. Imagine the difference to the economy of Japan and Germany. If I'd been running the Nation Brands Index in 1947, Japan and Germany undoubtedly would have been at the bottom of the list. They were pariahs. Nobody would dream of going to either country on holiday, hiring their citizens, buying their products, or anything of the sort. Today, because the United States is very often not at the top of the list, Germany is usually the most admired country on the planet. On average, most years these days, most admired country. Japan never far behind, third or fourth, certainly the top 5. So to go from most despised pariah state to most admired country on earth in just 70 years is a pretty remarkable achievement. And I consider that fast. That's about as fast as you can expect to go. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a really interesting proposition that actually no amount of propaganda, no amount of bragging about your assets or achievements, no amount of quote unquote nation branding is going to make the slightest difference to a country's position in this very strong, very rigid sense of the hierarchy of nations that everybody in the world has fixed in their minds. But what they might just do is they might notice if they start feeling glad that a country exists. And that will only happen, I've discovered, if the country does a number of things. First of all, it makes this its plan, not explicitly. This is nothing to do with talking. You don't go out and say, Luxembourg is going to fix climate change, or Britain is going to fix migration, because that's making a promise which people can then doubt. It's a promise you can break. It's a promise you can fail to live up to. It's just a bad idea for countries to talk. They should shut up and get on with it. And then if you make that your national strategy, and everybody has to agree, of course, this can't be a decision taken by government officials in closed rooms, then gradually over time, if you do things that prove that that is what you're all about and that's what you're trying to do, gradually, over the years, experience proves this will cause people to regard you more favorably, and in consequence, they will reward you with their custom. And it will cause your economy to grow at a faster rate than it otherwise would have grown. Now, it's not enough just to give a whole load of spare cash to poor countries, for example, because nobody notices that, apart from the recipients, of course. Nobody cares about it. And if you're a rich country, everybody expects you to do that. So I'm constantly getting the governments of rich countries complaining to me and saying, but we give so much money to overseas development. Why aren't we more admired? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. It's because that's exactly what people expect you to do. They figure that you've got a whole bunch of spare cash and it costs you nothing in any real sense to give it away to poor countries. And anyway, it's boring. Which journalist is going to write about the fact that Austria or Germany or the Netherlands has given away an extra million or a 10 million or a billion or whatever it is to some poor country? It's not interesting to people. It doesn't change the frame that they're living in. And so not only do a country's contributions to the global community, not only do they have to be strategic and focused along a particular challenge that that country has chosen to tackle, and not on its own, by the way, in partnership, of course, with other countries, but also the actions that they perform have to be somehow magical. They have to be imaginative. They have to capture people's spirit, or else nobody will notice and nobody care. Now, that's not an argument for doing PR stunts, of course. And it's only 1 in 10 of these actions has to be particularly noticeable. But unless some of them are sometimes, nobody will notice, and your efforts won't translate into a better reputation and therefore a better standard of living for your citizens. So let me close in the last 3.5 minutes or so, just by talking about the broader implications of all of this. We live, as we all know, because we keep on hearing it, in the age of the long crisis. It's just one damn thing after another. If it's not climate change or the pandemic, it's migration, it's human rights abuses, it's narco trafficking, small arms proliferation, nuclear proliferation, water shortages, species loss, habitat loss, antibiotic resilience, and so on and so on and so on. There are, well, the United Nations, as you know, has created its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are based on what it regards as the 17 key challenges. But of course, you can extend that list almost ad infinitum. I think that there are probably about 30 or 35 that are really, really quite significant and potentially existential. That is the age we're now living in, and that's pretty new. I don't think that humanity has faced quite so many potentially existential challenges all in one go. And the reality of the matter is that we're not making very much progress against most of them. Some of them we are. Poverty eradication is going relatively well. Pandemics, it's a shower, but some of the areas in which the international community has been tackling the pandemic has been pretty impressive. But the reality of the matter is that every single one of these problems is bigger than any country. No country can tackle any of these problems on its own. And therefore, fundamentally, what we should be looking at here is not 35 individual problems, oh my God, how do we solve them, but the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is a problem connected with the culture of governance. That ever since the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, all countries have conceived themselves, run themselves, framed themselves as competing, warring tribes. They are programmed to compete. Competition is absolutely fine. Competition is essential. It's part of human nature. Competition has lifted billions of people out of poverty. We would be unimaginable without it. But it becomes a problem when it's the only altar at which we worship, and that's been the case for the last 80 years. So what we need to do now is we need to shift to a new phase, if you like, in the human story. The first phase of the human story back from the Middle Ages onwards, indeed from when we walked out of Africa onwards, was conflict. We fought each other for territory and for treasure. The second phase, which we're still very much in the thick of today, is competition. It's a lot less bad than endless conflict. It's, if you like, a milder version of conflict. Competition has brought peace and it's brought prosperity, and it's also brought huge problems and huge inequalities. What we need to do now, because we're facing all of these challenges, is move into the third phase, which is collaboration. What we need is a change in the culture of governance worldwide, from fundamentally competitive to fundamentally collaborative. And where I'd like to finish is on the simple question: how can we bring that about? Because as Benjamin Franklin once observed, unless we all hang together, we are most assuredly going to hang separately. Thanks very much for listening.
So let's start with the questions. The first one came: to what extent do people now think of the EU as a country? Do we think of regions instead of countries? I can't see Simon now.
I'm here.
All right, there you are.
It's an interesting question. I asked myself exactly the same question a few years ago. So we included the European Union in the Nation Brands Index exactly as if it was a country, to see how people responded to it. Remember, this is the index that measures people's perceptions of countries. Let me just remind, forgive me for repeating here, but we're always talking about two main indicators here. One is called the Nation Brands Index, which is an opinion poll, and it measures the images of countries based on people's perceptions of them. The other one is the Good Country Index, which I didn't really talk about because there wasn't time, but that basically measures, in reality, each country's contribution to the world outside its own borders. So that second one, which I launched in 2014, is, if you like, a balance sheet for the world. It tries to calculate whether each individual country is a net contributor to humanity and the planet outside its own borders, or whether it's a free rider on the international system. And just before I go back to the EU, to put Luxembourg in context, I'm sure we'll come back to this because I was asked. The last time I included Luxembourg in the Nation Brands Index, in other words, measured its international image, it was around about 21st or 22nd. Didn't we say, Jill? Doesn't really matter. It's the same sort of part of the ranking out of 50 countries. So not super powerful, but certainly not negative in any way at all. The Good Country Index, I'm in a position delightfully to give you a sneak preview of the next edition, because I've almost right now just about finished calculating the results of the latest one, which is not yet published. So it's going to be coming out in the next week or so, but I can reveal exclusively, remember where you heard it first, that Luxembourg has actually gone up in the Good Country Index and is going to be probably 90% certain 11th out of about 150 countries. So relative to the size of its economy, Luxembourg is the 11th biggest contributor to humanity and the planet outside its own borders. So we ignore all domestic considerations. The contribution is not, repeat, not financial. Some elements of it are financial. There are 35 indicators in there. Some of them are about overseas aid, but the majority are not financial. They are to do with how well the country integrates and contributes in the areas of culture, health, well-being, security, knowledge, science, and so forth. Anyway, go back to the EU. The EU ranked pretty high, but most people didn't seem to know what it was. Beyond the European neighborhood, obviously. And it turned out afterwards, we did some subsequent polling, and we found that people were puzzled by the expression the European Union or its equivalent in their own language. They didn't know what that was. So that's quite interesting. They just assumed that it was some kind of fancy or official name for Europe, and therefore they ranked it very high because it's the most admired region on the planet. Perceptions of the institution itself, or the institutions amongst EU member states citizens, are a very different matter, of course. And I could spend all day on that.
Okay. Do you happen to know where the UK is in the new ranking?
No, off the top of my head, I don't know. But the UK in the Good Country Index is always in the top 10 or top 20. Remember, this is a list of 150 countries, so precise positions aren't statistically significant. If you're in the top 10, then you're basically one of the countries that contributes very much more than you take away. If you're in the bottom 10, it's likely that you're taking away more than you contribute. And maybe that's reasonable because you may be a very troubled country and you may need to take more than you give at this point in history. The opposite of a good country is not a bad country. The opposite of a good country is a selfish country, and selfish is not intended to be a criticism. In terms of the Nation Brands Index, well, again, we could talk all day about Britain's image, and I think there were some questions about that, weren't there?
Yes, yes, there were. Are there any tangible links between populism, that kind of thing, Brexit?
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah. Oh gosh, where do we start with populism? I don't have a problem with populism. I think populism is inherent in politics. Politics is about popularizing governance and the way that a society is managed. The kind of populism that makes complex governance and societal issues accessible to all levels of society is a really good thing. If, however, by populism we mean not really having a plan except to get elected by saying the things that focus groups tell us people want to hear, then that's not terribly smart, because in the end, governments are not companies. To a degree, you could conceivably run a successful company on that basis, simply by endlessly polling and finding out what the majority of people want and trying to deliver it to them. But as we've discovered, that's not good enough these days, and it never ever was good enough for governments, because just being able to get yourself elected has got very little to do with how good you are at running countries. And typically what happens is that populists find it relatively easy to get elected. It's a shortcut. You just tell people what they want to hear. You go rah, 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 and if you do it well, they'll elect you. But then you have to run the country, and that's where populists often lose interest because it's quite boring. It's quite technical. It's very, very hard to stay popular because the decisions you have to make every day are so conflicting. And what's more, you also have to govern the people who didn't vote for you, which populists don't like doing. So populists in office are generally speaking a disaster area. That's why Donald Trump is a disaster area, because he's a classic populist. And some populists warm to the task and become quite enthusiastic about being good at governing because they want more of that adulation and they want it from more people. Others don't. That may sound complacent. It doesn't mean that populism is going to go away tomorrow just because all the populists are bad at running countries, I'm afraid.
And thinking about the image, though, does populism and Brexit and everything else, will it damage the UK's reputation in the long term?
In the long term, it's really hard to say. What happened to the image of the UK in the Nation Brands Index after the referendum results came out? So 2016, but 2017 for the purposes of the study. Britain's overall ranking wasn't affected. Now, we run this study in 20 countries all over the world, so you obviously have to distinguish. Amongst EU member states, Britain's image did somewhat decline. People weren't very happy about Brexit, and particularly the enthusiastic Europeans, the Germans, the French, the Italians. They were very unhappy about Brexit, and in those countries, Britain's overall image dropped quite a long way. The Atlanticist nations, as you would probably expect, didn't punish Britain quite as hard, and in fact, the Danes, I think, actually showed slightly more respect for Britain after the referendum than before it. Globally, nothing happened, for the reason I think that I mentioned before, that nobody had any idea what Brexit meant. They knew that Britain couldn't be physically leaving Europe, that that David Cameron hadn't attached a large tug to the British Isles and towed them away from the continent. And so therefore it must be something bureaucratic and stupid and boring, that people weren't interested in some kind of trade association, and what's all the fuss about? That was the view of the world on average. And then gradually, even the countries that were slightly antipathetic towards the UK after the Brexit vote, in the intervening period, have gone back up again to their previous level. So today, the French, the Germans, the Italians, kind of like Britain almost as much as they did before the referendum. And I think one of the things that shows is that countries are attached to their traditional images by a piece of very, very strong elastic. There are bonds of real affection between the populations of Europe, which can be stretched but not easily broken. We've been together for an awfully long time, and I think most people are not thick, and they realize that the Brexit vote is not every person in Britain, and even the ones who did vote for Brexit aren't necessarily less nice than we thought or less interesting than we thought. What is going to happen in the longer term? Well, Britain is already declining in the Good Country Index. Its measurable contribution to the world outside its own borders has been declining for some time. We're still high up, but we're going in the wrong direction. And as the reality of Brexit begins to bite, I think we will find that its reality position diminishes. And as a consequence, its image will begin to decline, quite slowly, because people don't want to dislike the UK. But what's happening at the moment, forgive me if this is rather a long answer, but it's such a fascinating point. Britain is very unusual in that there were always two stories in people's minds about Britain. Strangely contradictory stories. One was the Downton Abbey story, that Britain is a posh, old-fashioned ex-colonial power, which a lot of people respect enormously, even in our ex-colonies, by the way, surprisingly, considering how much trouble we went to make them hate us. Many don't. It seems that after a generation or two, people forget how they met you. They just know they know you. But the Downton Abbey story has always been there, and it's a very dearly loved one. Lots of British people find it not very useful and rather cliched. And from the trade point of view, it's very useful if you happen to be selling cufflinks or Dundee marmalade, but it's not brilliant if you're selling high technology. However, as I said, Britain has two narratives, and the other one is what you might call the Carnaby Street, Mr. Bean, Cool Britannia version, which is that Britain actually, as well as being an old-fashioned, stuffy, arrogant, stuck-up, stately home where everybody has a butler, is also quite young and funky and innovative and does lots of pop music. And hold on, isn't Elton John British? And hold on, isn't David Beckham British? And this all reached a peak during Tony Blair's reign, when he was promoting the idea of Cool Britannia like hell, very sensibly. It didn't make any difference, but the idea that the Cool Britannia narrative was a useful one was very sensible. Let me, sorry, I'm going on too long. Let me just terminate that point very, very quickly, and then we can move on. What's basically happened with Brexit is that it's shifted the points on the railway track. And now anybody who thought that Britain might have been called Britannia has now reverted. Oh, it's Downton Abbey. Not necessarily bad, but colonial, bossy, stuck up, superior, doesn't want to play with the gang, isolationist, convinced it's still a major power. Phantom empire syndrome. You know, when you have a limb amputated, you keep on trying to scratch it. We've had our empire amputated and we keep on trying to scratch it. That's how we're perceived today.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the time. There are so many questions that we have. I just want to think about, because you wrote the book from a good country perspective, and I know from speaking to you that you've got some other things in the pipeline and maybe come down to an organizational level. So what's next for you?
Well, if the underlying mission, to use that horrible word, is to change the culture of governance worldwide from fundamentally competitive to fundamentally collaborative, the obvious next question is, okay, so who controls, who manages, who influences the behavior of human beings? And my first answer to that question was governments and countries, obviously, which is why all of my work, most of my work for the last 20 years, and the book were about the public sector. They were about how can we achieve that through countries and governments. The second book, it's a trilogy, or it will be. The second book is about companies, because of course corporations control just as many people, or nearly as many people, as governments and countries do, and in some respects more directly, and in a very different framework, but the influence is gigantic. And I mean, it's worth pointing out that the good country philosophy is nothing more or less than corporate social responsibility at the level of the nation state. It's exactly the same principle. And why wouldn't it be? It's the same consumers exercising the same choices for the same reason. So there's a lot of transfer of understanding and knowledge and opportunities for collaboration between the private and the public sector. The third book in the trilogy is about the third greatest influencer of public behaviors and attitudes, and that's religions and philosophies. But I've promised myself I'm not going to try and write that one till I'm 70. I don't think you should be allowed to write books about religion until you're 70.
Okay. So that gives you a little bit of time to focus on the second book. So for those of you who haven't read the book, you can't see this because I've got a virtual screen on. It's called The Good Country Equation. Lots and lots of, and thank you, Simon, lots of answers to your questions are in that book. There's a lot of people who've been talking to me over the last week. How can people get involved? How can you've said that 10% of the world's population, in fact, agrees that we should be kind to our neighbours and this, that, the other, and you could create a new country. And in fact, if I could have played Bob Marley to you as you came in, because you said you wanted a song for this country. So.
How can people get involved?
Thank you.
Well, if anybody here this morning does want to get involved and is interested in discussing that, the best and easiest thing is just to send me an email, actually. It's simon@simonanholt.com. I'm going to just put that on the chat. So if anybody wants to just take a copy of that. If they want to just have a look at some of the other projects that I'm working on at the moment, I keep on forgetting that I've just lost my most beautiful, beautiful domain, which was www.good.country, and I've lost it. I'm not allowed to have it anymore. It's really upsetting. So it's goodcountry.org now. I'm running a bunch of projects at the moment. I just noticed somebody in the chat window saying the Good Country Index needs a sponsor. Absolutely, it does. All of the projects that I do at the moment, I basically do on my own out of my bedroom. So the Good Country Index, it's basically me and a copy of SPSS doing the calculations, putting it online and begging favors. The Global Vote, which is a platform that lets anybody in the world vote on the elections of other countries If anybody wants to vote in the US presidential election, you can still do that. It's quite a useful thing to do. It makes a gesture, quite an important gesture. If we have more people outside the US voting on the next president than there are legitimate voters inside, I think that sends out a message. The Good Leader Index, which every month singles out the goodest or the ungoodest leader of the month on the basis of whether they have succeeded or failed in harmonizing their domestic and international responsibilities. Boris Johnson, when he offered visas to Hong Kongers, was unexpectedly the goodest leader a few months back. Most of the time he would qualify as being ungood because he's a nationalist and a populist of the wrong kind, in my opinion. Anyway, so anybody who would like to take a look at any of those projects, they all need help. They all need volunteers. They could all benefit from having powerful friends, partners, corporate partners, institutional partners, thought partners, delivery partners, tech partners. All of this stuff, in order to have any influence at all, needs to be somewhat ramped up. I get a lot of support from the UN. It's not financial support, it's more intellectual support than anything else. But that doesn't help to scale things up. I tried voting yesterday for the US elections, but the link does not lead anywhere. Oh God, that's terrifying. Which
I voted, so the lead I found.
I just clicked on it and it did lead. It went straight to the voting page.
Okay, Margarita will try again.
Margarita, yeah. Have another go. If you've still got a problem, try me. Drop me an email, please. Thanks for spotting that.
Okay, so as you say, we could have taken any one of these topics and spoken for a long time. I know that people will go away not having had all of their questions answered, but you've certainly given us food for thought. You've started off this long week of a leadership forum with a really great presentation. I can see in the chat that people are saying, excellent speaker. You were saying earlier, it's hard online. You don't get any feedback. You need to look in the chat for the feedback. So a great thank you to you, Simon. Thank you very much to everybody that came online. I hope that that you liked this format, and we have one of these every day this week. So thanks all very much. I'm going to close it. A final thank you again to Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
If you want to unmute your microphones now and say thank you and goodbye, please do. Let's have some noise.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye-bye.